The Pastimes is brought to you by Prairie Knights Casino and Resort.
The U.S. Scouts defend our country to protect their way of life. This is The Pastimes, your news from the edge of history. The Scouts who served at Fort Abraham Lincoln were called the Fort McKean Detachment of Scouts. Most of them were Indian Scouts in service for the United States, defending their way of life. Other Scouts were contracted civilians, holdovers from the last days of the fur trade era, who could speak the native languages fluently or knew the lay of the land like the back of their hand. The history of the U.S. Scouts serving our country goes back to before there even was a United States. It wasn't until the Civil War that Congress took note of the thousands of Indians who were already fighting for both the North and South. Entire companies and commands made up of Indians, including battles fought by Indians and against Indians, that Congress recognized the Indian service by forming an official branch for them, the U.S. Scouts. This new branch of the Army included an official insignia, crossed sabers with the letters USS. The Indian Scouts who served at Fort Abraham Lincoln began their service at Fort McKean, a two-company infantry post constructed in 1872. Fort Abraham Lincoln, a six-company cavalry post, was built a year later on the plains below the infantry post, and the new name encompassed both forts. The only thing to retain the name Fort McKean was the detachment of U.S. Indian Scouts. On July 6, 1872, Fred Gerard was hired as an interpreter at Fort McKean. He held his position until 1882. During his first year, he recruited several Arikara Scouts from Fort Buford, where activity was primarily running down deserters, to Fort McKean, where they engaged the Sioux in several hit-and-run raids. That first year, 7 Arikara Scouts died. The post surgeon remarked, "The Indian Scouts in the several skirmishes with the Sioux in October and November exhibited instances of the greatest personal bravery and fearlessness. Oftentimes, an Indian Scout could get messages through and mail through hostile territory where a white soldier or civilian scout could not. The Scouts provided General Custer with intelligence given with respect and were rewarded with preferential treatment. 40 Arikara Scouts were brought on to guide the military from Fort Abraham Lincoln to Yellowstone. Only 3 civilians joined the Indian Scouts to escort 20 companies of the 6th, 8th, 9th, 17th, and 22nd Infantry Regiments, and 10 companies of the 7th Cavalry, altogether about 1,500 enlisted men, about 350 Northern Pacific Railway survey crew employees, 4 scientists, and 2 members of the British nobility, all to Yellowstone country. On August 4th, 1873, the Yellowstone expedition reached the Powder River. About 90 men, including the Scouts, explored the Tongue River. There they were surprised when 6 Sioux men attempted to stampede their horses. The Sioux were driven off and pursued to a heavy stand of trees when an estimated 300 mounted Sioux warriors, led by Chief Gall, burst forth to fight. "Bloody Knife was the quickest draw," remarked General Custer, having shot and killed the first antagonist from horseback. The Scouts' bravery and guidance spared all the soldiers' lives but for 3. In the yearly report of 1873, Post Surgeon Middleton praised the service of the Scouts, saying, "There have been no successful desertions during the year. Although many have attempted it, deserters are easily overtaken by the Scouts and accompanying detachments." At some forts, the desertion rate was as high as 30% after many newly enlisted soldiers realized life in the Army in the frontier wasn't nearly what they expected. Middleton's acclaim for the Scouts pulling military service police duty was mirrored throughout Dakota Territory. Simply put, the Scouts were at home in a land where they were raised in and could read the features of a friend or foe in a glance. The Black Hills Expedition of 1874, led by General Custer, a journey intended to confirm the discovery of gold in the Black Hills, left Fort Abraham Lincoln guided by a detachment of Scouts that consisted of 22 Arikara and 38 Santee Sioux up from Nebraska. There was no written record if the groups ever socialized, but together they led about 1,200 men to the hills and back, covering nearly 1,200 miles. Professor Donaldson, a geologist on the expedition, remarked, "The Scouts are invaluable. Where they scour the country, no ambush could be successfully laid." On May 17, 1876, the Centennial Campaign left Fort Abraham Lincoln with the Scouts in lead, guiding about 1,200 men to meet their destiny at the Little Bighorn. 21 Scouts were left behind at Fort Abraham Lincoln, 12 at Fort Stevenson, and 6 at Fort Buford to maintain open lines of communication. In all, a total of 51 Indian scouts from the Arikara, the Crow, the Sioux, and the Piegan escorted and safeguarded the 7th Cavalry. Surgeon de Wolf wrote of the scouts, "We cannot be surprised very easily. The Indian scouts are all camped tonight outside us, scouts working 10 miles out. Indeed, no ambush or raid could be laid." The duty of the scouts was to guide the 7th Cavalry to the encampment of the Sioux and their ally, the Cheyenne. Vacant camps, trails, and other sign of the Sioux encampment led the Indian scouts to believe there were perhaps 5,000 of the enemy. On June 25, 1876, the Crow and Arikara, believing that they were likely seen approaching the Sioux, urged Custer to engage the enemy immediately if that's what they had come to do, or lose any advantage that surprise would give them. Despite the advice to General Custer to immediately go into battle with the Sioux, the scouts didn't seem to be as excited to fight as the general. Many accounts mention the scouts singing songs, plaiting their hair, painting themselves, and so on, not to take their time in meeting the enemy, but because many of them were preparing to meet the Creator, as some of them did that day. The scouts didn't have to be at the Battle of the Little Bighorn. Their duty came to an end the moment they ascended the Crow's Nest and directed General Custer to the direction of the Sioux encampment. The scouts voluntarily entered combat against the principles for which they were employed, and they went to take traditional honors by stealing horses. The Battle of the Little Bighorn didn't go as General Custer envisioned it would. Instead, a swift and utter downfall met his command. General Custer ordered the scouts into battle with Major Reno, whose experience fighting the Indians was none at all, primarily to distract the Sioux on one side so General Custer could flank the Sioux from the north. Dividing his command was a mistake, which paved the way for the general's last stand. Reno's witness to Bloody Knife's sudden death so rattled him that he ordered a halt and retreat 3 times. Bobtail Bull, Little Soldier, and Bloody Knife lost their lives. 2 others received wounds, Goose and White Swan, on Major Reno's retreat. Whether it was skirmishes at the infantry post, the cavalry post, or on the expedition, Indian scouts were the first in line to defend their charges. But most importantly, they protected our country to defend their way of life.